So now let's get into the science of meditation, which is a really cool topic because meditation has been around for thousands of years, and now we actually have tools that can filter all of these traditions through the lens of science to really get a sense of what works, how it works, and what doesn't work, which is especially useful if you're somewhat of a skeptic on meditation. Now, a lot of people will spend decades researching and trying to figure out the complete science of meditation and will still be left with more to learn. So we're only going to talk about 7 dimensions specifically: what meditation and pranayama does to our stress level through our HPA axis, the autonomic nervous system, the central nervous system, how meditation plays into depression, how meditation plays into anxiety, what meditation does to our physiology, and the science of yoga postures to start to get a basic overview of how meditation scientifically seems to work in our body and how specifically to attain some of the benefits that people talk about. So a lot of people want to know, how long do I need to meditate for? Which is one of the few questions where science can confidently provide an answer. And it turns out that if you want to have a clinically statistically significant benefit on average, you need to meditate for at least 20 minutes a day for 5 days a week, consistently for 8 weeks. Which means that on average, the studies on meditation seem to show that a lot of the benefits and neuroscience changes of meditation don't really start to kick in for the subject or patient until about 8 weeks of meditating for 80 minutes a week. But it could vary slightly per person depending on their sort of individual genetics and temperament. And the interesting thing is that no matter what you look at, whether it's mental illness improvements and things like depression, anxiety, OCD, narcissism, and addictions, or if it's physical health improvements in GI illnesses, eczema, lupus, cancer, pain, chronic body pains, or heart attacks, there always seems to be this consistent magic number of 20 minutes a day. And a prevailing theory for why this may be is due to how meditation affects stress physiology and physiologic anxiety, which is basically the non-psychological part of anxiety of when our body triggers a physical danger response that prepares us to fight or run away, and tends to activate in inappropriate circumstances because our brain learns that particular benign circumstances can actually be really dangerous. So we have something called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, which is essentially 3 parts of our body that govern stress. And stress starts when the hypothalamus secretes a certain chemical that then travels down to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is kind of like the master gland that has control of a lot of hormones. But one hormone that the pituitary gland secretes is called cortisol, which then travels all throughout our body, affecting our adrenal glands in the process. Hormones are chemical signals that travel with your bloodstream and affect your entire body, creating a body-wide signal. So unlike nerves that connect parts of your body and create a local effect where it doesn't affect anything else, hormones create a body-wide effect. The first hormone from the HPA axis that takes effect almost immediately is adrenaline. Adrenaline is secreted when cortisol from the pituitary gland travels to our adrenal glands and activates in less than a second, literally affecting our body faster than the speed of thought. It flushes throughout our entire body through our bloodstream and gives us a sudden burst of energy, increases our heart rate, boosts our blood pressure, causes diaphoresis with excessive sweating, and preps our body for immediate danger. Adrenaline also collapses our peripheral vision from 180 degrees to 30 degrees by dilating our pupils and making us incredibly focused on what's happening in front of us visually. And the interesting thing is that this concept of narrowing of focus also happens cognitively, because in physiologic anxiety, the adrenaline flowing throughout our system causes us to cognitively hyper-focus on particular thoughts and think in terms of black and white, not viewing the world from a whole perspective anymore and really struggling to unlatch or widen our view, making us sort of hyper-focused and tunnel down into one thing. The other thing adrenaline does to us cognitively is make us feel like perceived danger is real danger, blurring the line between hypothesis and reality. And part of the reason why physiologic anxiety is so crippling is because adrenaline basically flips on a switch in our brain that blurs the line between what's possible and what's real. Now, adrenaline isn't necessarily a bad thing, because evolutionarily, if we run into a tiger in the woods, even though the tiger technically isn't lethal yet because it doesn't attack you right away, and when you see it, you're still technically alive, so it's not really lethal, you want to think and act as if the tiger is lethal. And not being hyper-focused and sort of considering all the hypotheses and not thinking in terms of black and white could actually kill us. Speaking of evolutionary responses, there's something really cool called the mammalian diving reflex, which is kind of like the opposite of the fight or flight response. And mammals have a diving reflex that activates where when we go underwater, our body triggers a response that slows down our respiratory rate because we're underwater and don't want to be breathing rapidly, which then slows down our heart rate, decreases the speed of thought and makes us feel calm because our breath and emotions are linked, and stops that fight or flight response basically entirely. essentially having the opposite effect of adrenaline. Now, even though the mammalian diving reflex is supposed to evolutionarily get triggered by going underwater, the cool thing is that even if you don't have access to large pools of water to jump into every day, you can trigger the mammalian diving reflex by dumping your face into cold water for a few seconds with something like a bucket or a sink, which is what a lot of patients who are frequently in inappropriately high adrenaline sort of fight or flight states, so things like anxiety, panic attacks, or triggering trauma, and even like doctors or other professionals who need to quickly change their mindset to like a more calm mindset, often take advantage of this mammalian diving reflex by doing something called ice diving. The next hormone that affects our system is cortisol, which flows all throughout our body after activating our adrenal glands, and cortisol is all about sacrificing long-term health for short-term survival. And while adrenaline is a short-term stress hormone that gives us the energy we need to survive for the first 5 minutes, cortisol is responsible for keeping us alive for the next 24 hours. Because remember that if we run into a tiger, we first want our adrenaline to sort of increase our heart rate to send blood to our muscles and help us run away from the tiger. But since the tiger might still be nearby, we want a whole host of other responses to keep us alive over the next 24-hour period. Like a sustained energy level with metabolism that lets us cover a lot of ground to run away from the tiger. A high alert activated immune system for when we're running and possibly get like scratches, cuts, bites, or clawed on. And also for us to be mentally on high alert, have a very light sleep, and really try to pay attention to external sensory stimuli. Because the tiger might creep up on us when we're not paying attention to our surroundings or sort of when we fall asleep. So along with initially activating our adrenal glands, cortisol works on our metabolism, immune system, and something called the reticular activating formation. With metabolism, we want plenty of energy so that our muscles can walk a couple of miles away from the tiger, and cortisol signals our muscles and fat to break down and dump glucose, which is a form of energy, into our bloodstream, so that our muscles have sort of a constant source of fuel and with all the energy that they'll ever need. And if we're inactive while our bloodstream has high levels of glucose, our body thinks the reason our blood is so full of glucose is because we must have just eaten a meal, and activates another hormone called insulin, which stores all of that glucose as fat. So basically, if we're inactive when our body is stressful and physiologically anxious, cortisol can actually transform our muscles into fat. The next thing cortisol does is affect our immune system, and once our body has cortisol flushing throughout our bloodstream, in anticipation for potential infections we may get from running away from the tiger, like scrapes, bruises, like falling, claw marks, or being bitten, cortisol preps our immune system by activating these things called white blood cells, which are basically the soldiers of the immune system that help us fight infections. Now, normally we have a few white cells active and kind of calmly patrolling our system with a low alert kind of situation, right, where most of our white blood cells are actually held in reserve. But cortisol does something called demarginalization of white blood cells and activates 50% of all the white blood cells in our body because we want to be ready to sort of fight those infections if we get bruised, bitten, or scraped. The last thing cortisol does is increase the sensitivity of the reticular activating formation, or RAF, which is the part of our brain that governs sleep, wakefulness, and alertness. So if we run into a tiger, that stressful and physiologically anxious state will make it so that our RAF is hypersensitive. Because the night you run into a tiger, you don't want to be sleeping very heavily. You want a very sort of light sleep, right, and sleep lightly and not that many hours, because the tiger might still be around somewhere near you, which is exactly what our body and brain are concerned about. So when our RAF becomes hypersensitive, it's going to prevent us from getting a nice, heavy, relaxing sleep and makes it difficult to fall asleep and stay asleep for a long time, keeping us at a high level of mental alertness, since we don't want to be sort of relaxed if a tiger is still nearby. The other thing that a hypersensitive RAF does is make it hard to concentrate on one task, because we want our brain to be primed for a second dangerous encounter and attending to other sensory stimuli, like the sound of tiger footsteps and things like that. So our bodies didn't evolve to be happy, they evolved for us to survive back when we were still hunter-gatherers and cavemen. And these effects of physiologic anxiety, stress, cortisol, and the HPA axis were actually really helpful and great when we were actually out in the wild and ran into tigers every now and then. And cortisol did a great job at keeping us alive during these stressful periods. The hyper-focusedness and elevated heart rate from adrenaline was great at helping us run away or fight the danger in a focused sense. Cortisol affecting our metabolism and increasing our blood sugar level was great when we actually walked 8 miles during a stressful encounter. Our immune system being active when we're physiologically anxious and stressful was great when we were cavemen and didn't have things like antibiotics and sort of like actually got cuts and scrapes all the time. And the RAF making it hard for us to sleep or focus worked great when we were actually stressed that a tiger might sneak up on me and when we're sort of like not paying attention. But nowadays, the nature of physiologic anxiety and stress is constant, where I'm stressed about things like paying rent at the end of the month or paying off my student loans. And I have weeks and months straight of constant stress. And these circuits in my brain weren't designed to be on all the time. So when I'm stressed, my brain activates cortisol. So the first couple of minutes, the adrenaline makes me tunnel down my peripheral vision and sort of hyper-focus on particular thoughts, making me think in terms of black and white, and blurs the line between hypothesis and reality, where my blood pressure also increases and I start sweating a bunch. And that's just the beginning, because then the rest of the effects of cortisol kick in, with my metabolism, immune system, and the reticular activating formation being affected for the next 24 hours. Remember that cortisol is all about sacrificing long-term health for short-term survival, and cortisol breaks down muscle and fat, and in turn flushes our body with glucose, since it expects us to be moving around for a while. But nowadays when we're stressed, we just sit there, so our body gets confused and thinks, oh, we must have eaten a really big meal because there's all this glucose running in our bloodstream and we're not moving around, causing it to release insulin that converts all of the glucose into fat, making us more overweight at the expense of our own muscle. And when it comes to the immune system, stress and physiologic anxiety are comorbid, which means that people with physiologic anxiety also tend to have other issues like skin diseases and GI problems, which is all mediated by cortisol. So once cortisol activates 50% of our white blood cells, and since nowadays there's no infections for the cells to attack since we're kind of just sitting there all day, unlike our ancestors who would actually like get scraped and scratches and stuff when they were stressed, the white blood cells are kind of like trigger happy, itchy, and looking for a fight, and they actually end up attacking healthy tissues and other parts of my body, worsening autoimmune conditions, which is why nowadays people who are stressed and physiologically anxious have a lot of skin problems and GI problems, which is all due to an increase in cortisol. And with the RAF becoming hypersensitive, nowadays being stressed and physiologically anxious makes it difficult to fall asleep, gain restful sleep, makes our brain more prone to distraction when we're focusing on a task and attend to like external stimuli, and also prevents us from really relaxing and getting a good night's rest. Even though there's no tigers nearby, and there's no need to sort of be this hyper-vigilant. Now, all of this information about the HPA axis, adrenaline, and cortisol is really cool and all, but what does this have to do with meditation? So it turns out that meditating for 17 minutes at a stretch is what's required to shut off the HPA axis and reduce our cortisol production. So basically, if you're able to meditate for 17 minutes straight at once, you'll be able to turn off the HPA axis entirely for the next 24 hours. And now we start to see how meditation can help us, countering the effects of adrenaline, where meditation helps with like diaphoresis and elevated heart rates, and also sort of stops making us think in black and white and actually see the full picture. We can see how meditation helps with things like metabolism and weight loss, reducing the flooding of glucose into our bloodstream that insulin can then convert into fat by sacrificing muscle. We also see how meditation shows clinical reductions in severity of autoimmune conditions like GI problems, skin conditions like lupus, and even arthritis. And meditation also affects the RAF and reduces the alertness of our brain, hormonally improving things like ADHD and sleep. Remember that cortisol isn't necessarily all evil, because the HPA axis and danger circuitry are designed to help us survive. And if our stress level is too low, then you'll feel kind of bored, clumsy, sluggish, like unmotivated, maybe even a little bit depressed. But if your stress level is too high, then you'll feel like overwhelmed, debilitating, like hyperactive, and a little like anxious and on edge. So ideally what we really want is eustress, or a good balanced level of stress to really focus our mind and bring out our best self. So there's something called the flow state, which is basically the optimal state of activity, where we're highly conscious and our mind is also very active in like a very focused and precise way. Sometimes you'll hear athletes refer to it as the zone. And one of the goals of meditation is activating, training, and priming the mind, and using meditation to create a hormonal balance, either by pushing your stress level up or down. Because most people may need to stress down, since current society tends to be kind of stressful, but some people kind of feel like lazy and sluggish and may need to stress up to really sort of get in the zone. So anyone can use meditation and prompt themselves into a flow state, whether they're overstressed or understressed. And it turns out that the stress and sort of HPA axis and all this stuff is actually determined by something called the autonomic nervous system. So for thousands of years in the East, people have been talking about these concepts of yin and yang in ancient China, or in ancient India referred to it as Surya and Chandra, which is Sanskrit for sun and moon. And so in traditional Eastern medicine, these ancient doctors sort of noticed that our body has two modes of activity. And sometimes our sun or yang is more active, and sometimes our body is kind of like prepped and hyper and like ready to go. And there's other times where our moon or yin is more active and our body is kind of calm, chill, and relaxed. Now, this theory was developed thousands of years ago, and there's no real scientific evidence that yin and yang or Surya and Chandra exist anywhere in our body. But the cool thing is that the autonomic nervous system is actually a physiologic correlate that perfectly mirrors these concepts of yin and yang or Surya and Chandra. So the autonomic nervous system is divided into two pieces, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the mode of activity in our body when we're prepped to fight or flight, and the adrenaline survival activity system in our body, which also governs our HPA axis and cortisol. When the sympathetic nervous system is active, the changes that happen in our body are elevated heart rate and blood pressure, and we also tend to route blood more to like danger and survival circuitries of the brain, as well as our arms and legs. So we're more primed for things like danger calculations, running, and fighting. And we're also route less blood away from like our stomach and intestines. So sympathetic nervous system activities are things like playing sports when we're really sort of excited and maybe we're like dancing at a party, and also things like running away from danger or fighting something dangerous. And it's kind of our Surya mode or yang being active. The second part of our autonomic nervous system is something called the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is our body's mode of empathy, as well as rest and digest, governed by things like our vagus nerve, which is sort of this nerve that when it activates slows down our heart rate and decreases our blood pressure. So when our parasympathetic nervous system or Chandra or yin is active, our blood tends to go away from things like our arms, legs, and particular parts of our brain, and is more focused on internal organs like our intestines and stomach, and it's sort of our rest and digest mode. So an activity where the parasympathetic nervous system is very active is like a food coma, where if you eat a bunch of food, your brain sends a message to your whole body saying like, hey, right now it's time to digest, so let's calm down, reduce our mental activity, and like focus on digesting. So some people have a sympathetic nervous system that's hyperactive. When they're kind of like stressed, they have trouble digesting food because most of their blood is like routed away from that. Their heart rate is elevated, and they're a little bit like anxious and on edge. And some people have a parasympathetic nervous system that's hyperactive, where they're kind of low energy, have trouble getting out of bed, and feel like a little dull and depressed. So when it comes to meditation and pranayama, there are certain meditation techniques that calm down the sympathetic nervous system, calm down our yang or Surya, and really stimulate our parasympathetic nervous system, making us feel less hyperactive and like more calm. And there are other meditation techniques that will calm down our parasympathetic nervous system, or our yin or Chandra, and actually boost our sympathetic nervous system and make us more energized, active, and less sluggish. And there are even some techniques that are focused on balancing the entire autonomic nervous system, both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, and kind of equalizing it and evening out their yin and yang so that they don't feel too hyperactive, but also don't feel too sluggish, which really helps us like get in the zone with things like eustress and flow state. So it turns out that the nerves in our left nostril activate our parasympathetic nervous system, and the nerves in our right nostril activate our sympathetic nervous system. So we can literally stimulate our yin or Chandra or moon using our left nostril, and our yang or Surya or sun using our right nostril. In addition to the nerves in our nostrils, the timing of how we breathe also induces a specific kind of sympathetic or parasympathetic activity, where short exhalations increase our sympathetic nervous system activity, and long exhalations increase our parasympathetic nervous system's activity. So basically, the speed of exhalation determines the speed of your mind. So not only can we control our sympathetic and parasympathetic state through our nostrils, we can also control it with the speed of our exhalations, where slowing down exhalations activate our Chandra or yin, and fast short exhalations activates our Surya or yang. So now we're going to take a slight tangent and talk about how meditation plays into the central nervous system, because some of the strongest and most reliable research on meditation has to do with neuroscience and the brain. First up is the frontal lobes. And if you think about what's the difference between a 5-year-old, a 25-year-old, 45-year-old, 65-year-old, and so on, there are definitely physical changes, and the older ages may have more like memories than the younger ages, but there's also this concept of maturity, where an 85-year-old and 5-year-old are going to be cognitively very different. So this idea of maturity is governed by our frontal lobes, which governs things like impulse control and executive function, which is our ability to take a complex task and break it down into smaller pieces and then execute that task over time. And meditation strengthens your frontal lobes, improving your ability to control impulses and your ability to follow through with tasks. So there's actually a lot of different circuits that interact with each other in the brain, including the frontal lobes and the limbic system. The limbic system is where our emotions come from, so we'll feel things like happy or sad or anxious or angry, and our limbic system is actually hyperactive during these times. And our limbic system also includes something called the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that governs negative emotions like fear and pain. And the cool thing is that our amygdala is actually right next to our hippocampus, which is the part of our brain that facilitates learning and memories. So our learning circuitry is closely connected to our negative emotion circuitry. Since behavioral change and learning are closely tied, what we can infer from a neuroscience perspective is that experiencing negative emotions is the fastest and most powerful way to change behavior. Now, there's meditation techniques that affect our amygdala, hippocampus, and our limbic system as a whole, but when it comes to our frontal lobes, the frontal lobes and limbic system have reciprocal inhibition, which means that the frontal lobes can temporarily shut down the limbic system and vice versa. And sometimes there can be a war between your frontal lobes and limbic system, where even though you feel very worried or scared, there's another part of your brain telling you actually it's like all okay, it's all in your head, everything will be fine, you have nothing logically to be worried about. Or there will be times when you feel lazy and sluggish, and a part of your top-down thinking is telling you, we need to get up and do this thing. And this is basically the war in your mind between your emotions and your logical self. So this war between your frontal lobes and limbic system gets better when you meditate. And a lot of people give in to their impulses and their limbic system controls their frontal lobes. But as you meditate, your frontal lobes actually start to gain dominance over your limbic system through the war or through the reciprocal inhibition. Which doesn't mean that you don't feel emotions, but actually means that all of your emotions can be like framed nicely and put into context, and you can kind of gain distance from them, which allows you to overcome them. One part of our frontal lobes is something called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which involves things like empathy and compassion. And people who meditate on a regular basis develop greater compassion towards themselves and other people. Next up is the association cortices, which is the parts of our brain that attaches meaning to particular events. So for example, if I text someone and they don't text me back for a while, in that situation, sending a text and receiving a text are two isolated events. But what our mind likes to do is attach meaning to an isolated event. And our top-down thinking might produce thoughts like, they don't really care about me or like me anymore, or like, did I screw something up and make a mistake? And even though my friend could have forgotten their phone, or they weren't paying attention to it, or it was on silent or dead, there could be 1,000 possibilities for why my friend didn't respond to the text that have nothing to do with me. But our association cortices start to see meaning in benign places. So when we meditate for a long time, we actually start to separate out from the association cortices, and the power of the association cortices starts to decrease a little. So this is really cool because a common topic in meditation is the Sanskrit word vairagya, which means detachment, or gaining distance from events in your life. Taking a step back and looking at the big picture, not getting so caught up in stuff. And the ability to detach and take a step back is governed by control over the association cortices. And people who regularly meditate are able to take a step back, see the big picture of things, and actually don't quite get as bothered by events. So we've talked about stress physiology, the autonomic nervous system, and a couple of neuroscience circuits that get affected by meditation. And now we're going to tunnel deeper into how meditation neuroscientifically helps with things like depression and anxiety. So when it comes to the neuroscience of depression, there's a lot of different avenues to it, and researchers will spend their entire lives studying it and still barely have a tiny amount of information. But one neuroscience development that helps us understand what really goes on in the brain of someone who's depressed is the discovery of something called the default mode network. The default mode network is the circuit in our brain that grants us the capacity of self-awareness. And if you look at the difference between humans and animals, the difference is this capacity of self-awareness and being able to think about ourselves and our influence on the external world. All living creatures presumably have thoughts and emotions because they're feeling sad or angry and they want look for food and stuff. But what separates humans from everyone else is the ability to look at our own thoughts. And this capacity is what's given to us by the default mode network, because it turns out that not many animals actually have this neuroscience circuitry in the brain. What this practically means is, let's say a raccoon is trying to find food from a set of 10 garbage cans. It looks at can 1 and sees there's no food, so thinks, well, there's no food in this one, so I'll move on to the next one. And then it goes to can 2 and sees there's no food in that one either, and thinks okay, nothing in this one, so on to the next one. And it goes to can 3 and so on and so forth until it finds food from one of the cans. Now let's say a human is given the same task of trying to find food from a set of garbage cans. The cool thing is that when the human looks at can 1, they actually have the same exact thought of, well, there's no food in this one, so I'll move on to the next one. And may look at can 2 and think, well, there's nothing in this one either, so on to the next one. But after a few cans, the human's mind produces the thought of, maybe I'm doing something wrong, right? Humans have this capacity of like self-reflection on actions and say things like, maybe I'm not looking at the right area and like all the cans here have already been plundered, or maybe I'm not checking the cans properly. Even though both the raccoon and the human are given the same tasks, the raccoon doesn't start to feel like it's doing something wrong and literally assumes it keeps getting unlucky. Whereas the human can say things like, maybe I'm being an idiot. What am I doing wrong? And while a raccoon doesn't reflect on its sense of identity if it fails at finding food from the trash cans, even though the human failing at a task just means the human failed at a task, and it doesn't say anything about who they are as a person, humans have the ability to reflect on an action that happens in the past, like failing or succeeding at a task, and then adopt an identity of I am a failure or I am a legend in the present. And the ability to create and carry an identity in the present based on what they did in the past comes from the default mode network. So the capacity of meta-level thinking about our sense of self comes from the default mode network. And this ability of not writing everything up as good luck or bad luck and being able to think about how we may be at fault and responsible for the results of certain actions is basically what allowed humans to dominate this planet. Because once we become responsible for something, then we have the power to change it. The interesting thing is that in depression, our default mode network goes haywire and becomes hyperactive. And when you have a mind that's depressed, you get stuck thinking about yourself and thinking negative things about yourself. And your brain makes you hyper-focus on your influence of something going a particular way. It tries to make you responsible for any event happening, making you feel like everything is your fault. Normally, our default mode network isn't hyperactive, and our mind strikes a healthy balance between thinking about ourselves and thinking about the external world. So for example, normally if I go to a party and think that I'm ruining other people's experience at the party, when I see other people smile when they see me, I'll think or focus on that external stimuli and become sort of more comfortable with being at the party. But for someone who's depressed and has a default mode network that's hyperactive, they don't have that same response because their mind pushes away that external sensory stimuli and is instead focused on the constant commentary about themselves running in their top-down thinking part of their mind. Which is why if someone tries to reassure someone who's depressed, the reassurance often gets swatted or pushed away because their attention is focused on their top-down thinking and is stuck thinking negatively about themselves, which is neuroscientifically very difficult to stop doing while the default mode network is hyperactive. So if the default mode network becoming hyperactive is what leads to the depression of us constantly thinking negative thoughts about ourselves, it should logically follow that if I could magically flip a switch and turn off that default mode network, then depression should get better, which is exactly what recent advances in psychiatry have discovered as a treatment for depression, even treatment refractory depression, called ketamine. So ketamine is also a drug of abuse and has fines in many parts of the world, so it should be used sort of under the guidance of a medical professional. But ketamine is a dissociative agent that allows people to unplug from their life. And when people suffer a lot and get high on ketamine, they kind of pull the plug off of all their problems that are swirling around them that they're getting caught up in. And once they dissociate from themselves, it gives them a sense of peace. And it turns out that when you give a depressed patient ketamine, it shuts off their default mode network and gets them to have distance from themselves, resulting in feeling less depressed within hours. So there's good evidence that artificially shutting off the default mode network through ketamine improves depression, but the problem with ketamine is that it's a substance of abuse, and once the substance wears off, the default mode network can sort of reactivate and become hyperactive again, making us addictively gravitate towards the ketamine again. So if ketamine works great at artificially temporarily shutting off the default mode network, is there some way to permanently shut it off or at least keep it toned down on a more daily sense? And the answer is yes, through meditation. Because studies on meditation show that meditation shuts off the default mode network on a more long-term basis, especially if you're a frequent meditator. So the yogis who have been talking about meditation have been saying for thousands of years that one of the benefits or goals of meditation is to develop vairagya or detachment. And as we meditate more and more, we're literally systematically training our minds to detach and sort of training our brain to also shut off the default mode network. When someone is suffering from something like a breakup, for example, what people say to them to feel less pain is things like take a step back. Don't get so caught up in yourself. There are other fish in the sea and things like that. And what we're trying to do in that moment is get them to detach from all the pain and sort of swirling awfulness that they feel in the moment and to look at the big picture. And when we encourage someone to do that, and it does work, that's when the default mode network starts to shut off because they start to think about other things and aren't sort of like so caught up in themselves because they've developed a sense of vairagya. Along with depression, meditation also neuroscientifically helps with anxiety. And the neuroscience of anxiety is a little more complicated than the neuroscience of depression because anxiety actually involves a lot of different regions in the brain. And as we start to understand each region, the way in which meditation helps with anxiety becomes way clearer. And for any given person, addressing one aspect of the brain may be insufficient. So we really need to understand and look at which parts of the brain anxiety works on and what kinds of meditation techniques helps for each region of the brain. So the first thing we need to talk about is the difference between fear and anxiety, because these are both discrete neurological and cognitive processes, and these two different experiences are reflected in our neuroscience, involving different pieces in our brain. Fear circuitry is all about dealing with or running away from a present and existing danger that is already realized, and leads to a rapid behavioral response, inducing actions like fight or flight, but can also lead to automatic responses like sort of freezing up or being paralyzed when actually in the face of danger. Now, unlike fear, anxiety is about possible danger that hasn't quite happened yet but could happen, like a lasting state of apprehension of potential future threats, making the feeling of danger more diffuse and uncertain, and leads to our brain more in the direction of prevention and avoidance, not to act like, fear responses direct us to do. In our bodies, anxiety is also accompanied by an autonomic response, priming us for action by elevating our heart rate, releasing cortisol, making our brains more alert by increasing vigilance, and gets us ready for when the fear actually presents itself. Also leading to negative affect or negative alterations in mood, leading us to things like avoidance or stepping away from the situation entirely. So an example to understand the difference between fear and anxiety is, let's say I'm anxious about someone ringing at my doorbell being a murderer. So when I'm kind of slowly walking towards the door and I'm anxious that the murderer is going to kill me right when I open the door, that experience is very different in my body, brain, and mind from actually seeing the murderer pull out a knife at me. When I'm anxiously walking towards the door, I'm filled with anticipation, worry, and dread. And once I see the dude pull out the knife, my response is far more immediate and reflexive. There's nothing to dread or anticipate because I see the knife and it's coming right at me at high speed. And I freak out and shut the door immediately and run away. So when it comes to neuroscience, fear is generated in our central nucleus of something called the amygdala. And when our amygdala activates, our response is very short in duration, so it stays active for a couple of seconds or minutes. And studies show that when the amygdala is destroyed, people can still feel anxiety, but their fear response is diminished. Which is why anxiolytic medications like benzodiazepines or alcohol still work, because they actually function in a different part of our brain called the BNST. And a Western approach to reduce the severity of the amygdala is exposure therapy. If we think about our brain like a car, our amygdala is like our nitro boost, a temporary jet fuel to give us a huge burst of speed and prime us for action. Now, anxiety comes from a slightly different place called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, or BNST. So the BNST is more central to creating anxiety, governs unpredictable threats. It's kind of where uncertainty is born in our brain, making us worry, being more future thinking, and kind of predicting danger. And the BNST's response has a more sustained duration, so the amygdala is short term, the BNST is more long term, where stress hormones like CRF actually activate the BNST. And it also has to do with our GABA system, which is a calming system in the brain, and a lot of the medications around anxiety, like benzodiazepines and even alcohol, work on the GABA system. In addition to anti-anxiety medications like SSRIs or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that inhibit the BNST over long-term time. So the stria terminalis, or BNST, is like our gas pedal for anxiety, and is what makes our mind go at super high speeds for hours at a time, giving us a constant sense of anxiety. Next up is the medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC, which is a part of our frontal lobes, and is like the control circuit for the brain, regulates attention, affective or emotional information processing, and allows us to restrain and direct our attention. And when someone has thought loops or can't shake anxiety about something, even if they know it's irrational, there's actually a war going on between their BNST and MPFC, where the MPFC is actually losing. So anxiety lives in the BNST, and the part of your brain trying to control your anxiety is the MPFC. And sometimes your brain succeeds in controlling the anxiety and the MPFC wins, and sometimes you give in to your anxiety and that's when the BNST wins. The Western approach to strengthen the MPFC or frontal lobes is with cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps us control our amygdala and BNST. And with our car analogy, the MPFC or frontal lobes are like the brakes for anxiety, where when it malfunctions, we can't control our anxiety anymore and it kind of keeps going on and on. The last part of the brain we'll touch on when it comes to neuroscience of anxiety is the hippocampus, which is the central memory and learning structure in the brain, where memories are formed and stored. And when it comes to anxiety, the hippocampus provides contextual information in environmental circumstances, because anxiety is actually really context dependent. For example, the hippocampus is the reason why my phone suddenly ringing when I'm alone at my home isn't that big of a deal for me, but that same external sensory stimuli of phone suddenly ringing can cause me to freak out if I'm in the middle of a conference with my boss, or I'm taking a test in a quiet classroom. The hippocampus is also the reason why a warm hand on my cheek when I'm in bed at night with my partner is a really pleasant and fuzzy experience. But that same experience of warm hand on my cheek at night becomes absolutely terrifying if I'm sleeping alone in a hotel room. So even though the sensory stimulus is exactly the same, it's the context that the stimulus happens in which forms our response to something, and that contextual component is given by my hippocampus, where our learned experiences change the way we look at things and can sometimes result in anxiety. So our hippocampus is like the road, the context of the car analogy of anxiety, determining what triggers our anxiety, where our anxiety is headed, and when we can relax. And the treatment approach to altering our hippocampus is exploratory psychodynamic therapy, where you're sort of talking with the therapist about your past memories and stuff. And also exposure therapy helps with this a little as well. So these are the four major parts of the brain that interact with each other during anxiety, where the relationship or sometimes war between these regions results in anxiety. And sometimes there can also be a genetic component where some people have a strong MPFC in control of their amygdala kind of by default, and other people are born with their amygdala sort of controlling their MPFC. And the idea of genetics determining your tendency, proneness, and sensitivity of making you more likely to be anxious is known as neuroticism, and lives in the interaction between these four pieces. Now we're going to look at how meditations play into the interaction between these four pieces to give us a very specific and targeted approach to anxiety neuroscientifically. Because meditation works on a lot of different ways depending on what kind of technique you're using. Pranayama techniques have been shown to adjust and kind of calm down our BNST and amygdala in the short term, so basically like decrease our fear responses and prolonged worrying. And in the long run, like daily 20 minutes for 8 weeks causing neuroscience changes and stuff, meditation boosts our frontal lobes. And the difference between a child and an adult is actually development that comes from the frontal lobes. So once you become a frequent meditator, you don't give into your impulses as much, and you control your emotions instead of letting your emotions control you. And there's even some meditation techniques like Manipura Chakra techniques and digesting samskars. These words may not mean a whole lot yet. And these are kind of memory-oriented meditation techniques around processing past emotions that work on the hippocampus and rewire the context of our brain. And we start to change the conceptualization of the truths we learned in the past that make us worry today. So this was kind of a basic overview of the neuroscience of anxiety, and the reason that understanding the neuroscience is useful is because everyone's individual constellation of how their anxiety presents itself is going to be slightly different and require a slightly different approach from a neuroscience perspective. Because some people may have a big fear response problem, where they get a burst of adrenaline and energy, or their mind is kind of going at high-speed, future-focused thinking with a lot of uncertainty. So they may need to do some pranayama techniques to calm down their amygdala or BNST. Some people struggle with emotional information processing and keep falling into their impulses and let their emotions win. So they may need to do meditation for the sake of strengthening their MPFC and frontal lobes. And some people may contextualize anxiety inappropriately and feel anxious in very kind of benign circumstances. So they may need to focus on their hippocampus and revisit past memories with meditation. Once you become aware of which neuroscientific feature of anxiety you specifically struggle with, then you can start to make more specific and tailored changes through meditation. Now, all this stuff about neuroscience and meditation is cool and all, but what does meditation actually physiologically do to my body? So all of us are unconsciously, or without noticing, breathing constantly throughout the day. And it turns out that practicing pranayama can actually change the way you unconsciously breathe throughout the day, breathing deeper, less from the chest, and more from the stomach. And since our breath controls our emotional state and vice versa, we can use this principle to sort of cultivate a sense of always feeling somewhat calm, which helps play into this concept of enlightenment. Along with constantly feeling relaxed, it turns out that trippy and spiritual experiences in meditation with an expansion in consciousness and things like that are believed to be caused by toxically elevated levels of CO2 in the brain for a prolonged period of time. And when you meditate on a very regular basis and change the way you unconsciously breathe, your body starts to acclimatize to low levels of oxygen, high levels of carbon dioxide, and naturally creates a very low respiratory rate. So normally, our CO2 levels being too high leads to acidosis, or too much acid being in the body, which usually leads to more breathing, because when your CO2 is elevated, your brain tells your body to breathe more so you can breathe off that excess CO2. But when you meditate on a very regular basis and drop your respiratory rate unconsciously, your body becomes so acclimatized to high levels of CO2 that it recruits other kinds of mechanisms that don't require rapid breathing to maintain a very low respiratory rate whilst not damaging you. So when your heart becomes hypoxic or starved for oxygen, it does two things, one in the short run and one in the long run. And while the short-term effects of hypoxia is vasodilation, where the heart dilates and increases the width of the coronary arteries, which allows and facilitates more blood flow, the long-term effect of chronic hypoxia is angiogenesis, where the heart sends signals to the rest of your body to make more blood vessels, which causes collateral circulation, which is what happens when you meditate for chronically prolonged periods of time and your body acclimatized to it, and why meditation isn't damaging for the body. So the really cool thing is that if you get a blocked coronary artery when you're a regular meditator, the damage from that coronary artery is going to be way less than if you didn't meditate, because your body has already developed alternate paths of circulation through meditation, which is the exact mechanism of how meditation literally, physiologically, protects you from myocardial infarctions or heart attacks. So as our breathing rate goes down, our oxygen level goes down, and you can't normally meditate for 20 minutes a day until you get really good at it, which is how we'll hear stories of yogis in the Himalayas or people like Wim Hof who go into semi-hibernation states and barely wear anything in like extremely cold weather, which is sustainable because they do bizarre things to their physiology. The last thing we'll do in this section of the video is talk about the science of yoga asanas or yoga postures and touch a little bit on the mind-body connection of human beings. So if you look at a lot of clinical studies on health improvement of yoga postures versus stretching, or even yoga postures versus exercise, a really common result is that yoga postures often outperform exercise and stretching when it comes to outcomes of clinical health improvement. That may sound kind of weird because yoga poses are essentially the same as stretching. You may think that exercise would outperform yoga poses because exercise requires more energy than doing a yoga posture. So a prevailing theory for why yoga postures are the best for clinical improvements is that the yogis may have stumbled upon a system of using the body's own mechanisms that actually make perfect sense scientifically to try and help people with pain. Whether it be physical pain, like a dysfunction that's causing them concern in their body, or mental pain, like worrying all the time, regretting all the time, things like that. Because the body actually has a lot of innate reflexes where it essentially turns on some muscles and turns off other muscles that in turn benefit us in the process. A good example is like if you've ever tried pushing against a stationary object, like a wall, pole, a really heavy object, and you believe that the object's not going to move, what our brain tends to do is actually send signals to those muscles that are being activated during this isometric contraction, the muscle's not lengthening or shortening, and actually makes the muscles relax, because it doesn't like to waste energy on something where there's no eccentric or concentric motion happening. And our belief in the back of our mind that, hey, actually, I don't think this wall's going to move no matter how hard I push against it, causes our mind to create and induce relaxation in that muscle group. One way yoga postures help is by using that body's response to isometric contraction in order to induce relaxation and increase range of motion in spasmed areas. Because yoga postures, or asana, is essentially an isometric contraction where you take and hold a position for a while. And this induced relaxation is partially what helps calm down our mind in the long run through our HPA axis. Another reason why yoga poses are superior to exercise is because of breathing. Remember that the HPA axis is directly affected upon by our sympathetic or parasympathetic state, and we can control that state based on how we control our breathing. So basically short exhalations induce sympathetic activity, and long exhalations induce parasympathetic activity. When we hold our breaths, we actually decrease our ability to sort of breathe properly and naturally heal. And yoga exercises does is really institute proper breathing mechanics with diaphragmatic breathing, where the belly's coming out and lower rib cage is sort of coming to the side. The third way asana, or yoga postures, are superior to exercise is because eccentric contraction, which is where muscles are lengthening but still contracting to control your muscles, is actually the best way to rehabilitate injured muscles, so Achilles injury, calf injury, and things like that. And eccentric contraction is actually what doctors and most physical therapists often focus on first with injured patients. So while this eccentric contraction is often missed out on with something like weightlifting, yoga postures and asana really focus on those eccentric contractions, because most of asana is about stillness, not movement. And the movement that you do act on are all very slow movements where you gradually move from one place to another, which is where you get so much of that benefit, in addition to all the stress reduction stuff with the HPA axis. So this was a couple of the key features of the science of meditation. And to sort of recap this first section of the video, meditation introduction has 3 topics. What is meditation? History of meditation, and science of meditation. What is meditation was all about defining the different Sanskrit translations for the word meditation and touching a little bit on enlightenment. History of meditation was looking at how meditation evolved throughout the ages through different styles of yoga and different traditions as a whole. And science of meditation was all about what meditation does with our stress physiology, autonomic nervous system, the neuroscience benefits of meditation, and how meditation affects our physiology. So this chapter was kind of a quick overview on the science of meditation, and there will hopefully be a little bit more information on the science of meditation sort of sprinkled in with particular techniques towards the end of the video. And the next section of the video will really get into the fun stuff with the discoveries of meditation, starting with the metaphysics of the meditative worldview and how the yogis conceptualized and understood how the universe worked.